You have our gratitude for taking this opportunity to share with us the memories of our time here in La Crosse. We hope that as you learn more about African Americans and the impact we have had in this community, that you will be inspired by us.
He was on the track team at La Crosse High School. He was the first athlete to be a Badger at UW-Madison. He was a Big Ten champion. He was a scholar and an Olympic champion. He broke ground on so many levels. And Pogue Park is a testament to that. My name is Nellie Pogue, and I am the older sister to George Coleman Pogue. Our parents, James and Anna Pogue, were born into slavery, but they were freed by the results of the Civil War. We came to La Crosse in 1884. Father was a coachman for Mr. A.W. Pettibone on his estate at 8th and King. Now George was 3½. And I was 6, and our older sister Lulabelle was 17. You see, we were only the second and third black students at La Crosse High School, which is now called Central High School. And George loved to read. Well, he worked hard and he studied hard, and when he graduated from high school in 1899, he graduated as salutatorian of his class. The topic of his speech was a civic phase of the race problem, where he talked about how African Americans were U.S. citizens, but the government wasn't doing anything to protect the civil rights of its black citizens. It was very controversial. But I'll tell you, it was not his academic prowess that got the city of La Crosse to change the name of that park. It was his athletic ability. You see, when he was in high school, he loved to run. This is him. He loved to run, and he was on the track team. And at a track meet with Winona, he not only won the 50-yard dash, but he set a new Wisconsin state record. It was absolutely amazing. Now that's what got UW-Madison interested in him, and he went to school there for college. Now he joined the Literary Society and the Public Debate team, but he also was excellent at the track team. And this is him in 1903 with the track team. He had the respect and admiration of his coaches and his teammates. But I'll tell you something, the university forgot about him because it took them 10 years after he graduated before they gave him his athletic letter. 10 years after all of that. Now 1904 was the year of the third modern Olympiad. The Olympics were held in St. Louis that year. And George represented the Milwaukee Athletic Club, and on August 31st, he made history. He was the first African American to win an Olympic medal. He won a bronze medal for the 400-meter hurdle. And then the next day, he made history again by winning another bronze medal in the 200-meter hurdle. It was quite impressive. Now, what happened after that? If he'd been white, the sky would have been the limit. But he wasn't white. He was black. And it was 1904. Now, I had since moved to East St. Louis and taken a teaching job. Mother had joined me there also. We felt that St. Louis had more to offer the black community, and they had an up and moving black middle class. George came also, and he started teaching at Sumner High School. It was the first all-black high school west of the Mississippi. He taught Latin and English there for 9 years. Afterwards, there was some soul-searching and farming in Minnesota, and then he ended up in Chicago, But Jim Crow laws were so firmly in place that despite his athletic abilities and his academic abilities, he couldn't find a job in his field. It was very frustrating. So he came to terms with that and became a clerk in the postal office in Chicago. And he stayed there for the next 29 years, moving through the ranks. Now, my son, Howard Jenkins Jr., became a prominent lawyer, served on the legal team that argued before the Supreme Court in the matter of Brown versus the Board of Education. In 1960, President Kennedy elected him to be on the National Labor Relations Board, and he stayed in that position for the next 20 years, serving under 4 presidents. George was very proud of the work that his nephew was doing, ensuring the civil rights of all Americans. Our mother had taught us that we were just as good as anyone, and evidently that fact had stuck.
After the war, we moved to Wisconsin.
It took his family 2 years to move. Well, actually, they walked. Can you believe that? They walked all the way from Tennessee to Wisconsin. I suspect, though, that they stopped along the way to work and rest before moving on again.
You see, George had his mind set on a farm in Wisconsin. He'd heard about the free black farming communities in Grant and Vernon counties, and so that's where he was headed. He knew the way, so we followed.
My family settled Rebels Valley in Vernon County in 1854. They traveled all the way from North Carolina to Indiana to escape the Black Codes and Fugitive Slave Act. You see, they were free people of color who risked being sold into slavery while still living in North Carolina. So finally, they were forced to leave Indiana for that very same reason. Now, they also heard of the fertile farmland in Wisconsin. They also heard that the state was prepared to fight the Fugitive Slave Act in court.
My family arrived in 1880 and purchased our small farm. Well, it was a sad day in 1881 when George died with his dreams left unfulfilled. He'd willed his farm to his daughter, Mary, who had almost lost it to debt. But our brother Tom was able to save the farm by purchasing those debts off.
Now, Ashley's heart was never in farming, though. But his brother Thomas had very creative plans for the farm, as did his son Alja. Now, Thomas would go on to own the largest black-owned farm in all of Wisconsin. And he knew so much about farming that people from throughout the state came to talk to him, even county agriculture agents. In Alja, he built most of those round barns that you all see in southeastern Wisconsin. Now, in 1890, Ashley started living in the Crosse during the winters to serve an apprenticeship in the Moss & Sons barbershop, under the tutelage of Zachariah Lewis Moss.
In 1893, I'd finished my apprenticeship, and Ellen and I were married.
Now, during this time, we settled into the barbershop business between 1895 and 1905, and we had 4 children. Now, one of them, John Ashley, died as a baby and is buried in Oak Grove Cemetery.
Our barbershops, they were in our home. So can you imagine trying to raise children in the midst of men coming and going for haircuts and shaves? We always tried to rent very large houses with a separate space between the living areas and the barbershops. These large homes, they allowed us to open them up as boarding houses for outsiders who were coming to visit La Crosse.
Now, even though there were no legal restrictions against people of color staying at hotels or eating at restaurants, you better believe that they had their ways of making us feel unwelcomed. Now, after the children were grown, I opened a cafe in the space that was used as a barbershop. And in so many ways, it was such a relief. There wasn't a constant stream of men in and out for haircuts and shaves, and I only served breakfast and lunch.
To think of it, I never kept regular hours as a barber. I barbered whenever anyone came to the door. I'd never hung a shingle that read Ashley Shivers Barbershop, open 6 a.m. to 3 p.m.
Now, black barbers only cut and shaved white men officially, that is.
Well, white men didn't want to do business where black men had their beards and haircut. Now, everyone gave reasons why, but we all knew it came down to one thing.
Racial attitudes.
No one wanted to risk mixing of the races.
Now, you all didn't want to cut women's hair either.
Okay, see, now that was different. We have real reasons for that.
Now, do not say that women print, pat, and puff their hair more than men.
Okay, I won't.
Now, Ashley and other barbers did work overtime in their homes with black customers. Many were served separately even before separate facilities were established.
Yeah, Ellen and I, we lived comfortable lives here, and we did well financially. So we extended ourselves into our community. But we both saw the cruelty in people over race. We couldn't let it consume us, nor let it stand in our way.
You just have to look around and ask yourself, what more can I do?
Ellen and I were very productive lives here in La Crosse.
White family. My father, Zachariah Moss, had his shop on Pearl Street between 2nd and 3rd. We were barbers and tonsorialists. Tonsor means to cut or shave. Now, in the really old days, we would also do minor surgery and dental work. That is the reason why you would see the red and white stripe going in a diagonal pattern on the barber pole.
La Crosse was a city built on trade and transportation. Railroads and riverboats brought men into our barber shops. Fashion and necessity brought most of them in every other day for a shave or at least once a month for a haircut. But you lost money on some.
More than some. Hundreds of men came and went. 3/4 of them did not want a haircut or a shave for 3 months. Lumberjacks and longshoremen were not a group to recruit for haircuts and shaves.
Let's not get too hard on the rivermen. Your father's wealth began with his work on the river.
Yeah, you're right. You can't forget where you come from. My father came up the Mississippi working on packet boats. He was a barber and born a free man in Wheeling, Virginia in 1824.
Thousands of free people of color moved west from Georgia, Virginia, and the Carolinas after Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831. Black codes had been restrictive prior to the rebellion, but after the rebellion, southern states threatened to arrest and sell free people of color into slavery if they remained in the states.
Then, in 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act was signed. Some northern states began writing black codes, forcing free people of color out of places like Indiana and Ohio. I know my wife's Emma's family was part of this mass movement from the East Coast, and my family was also.
You've already met my sister Ellen, Ashley Shiver's wife. Our family moved to Wisconsin from Indiana and settled in Cheyenne Valley just outside Hillsborough in Vernon County. Ellen and I came from a large family. Our mother always said it was in the water. Anyway, after spending some time as a teacher in Baraboo, I met Zachariah. We moved back to La Crosse in 1897 and married, just before Zach's father died in 1902.
And I was born right here in La Crosse in 1866. My shop was much like my father. I had 3 chairs. I hired a bootblack, a porter, and 2 barbers, and I took on at least 2 apprentices each year. Each year, hundreds of young men would move through the apprenticeship programs offered by Ashley Shivers, John Burney, and I.
I was especially proud of their work teaching apprentices to read, write, and prepare for business, but I was particularly proud about what the newspaper said about Zachariah. Go into the new Moss barber shop and see the old hands at work. Take down your old razor to get ground. Get shaved while it is ground, and you'll be sure to leave it there. You'll forget all about your razor. Service. That's what kept Zach in the newspapers.
And we got in the newspapers for other things too, such as the boxing ring in back of the shop.
Zach, how did you get any work done with all that talk about boxing?
You know, my father and I, we built our business from the men working on the riverboats and the railroads. And see, these men love boxing. And Dad and I, we love boxing. At the end of the day, when the trains would come in, these men looked forward to having a Turkish bath and a good shave. And then they would come back in the evening to enjoy bare-knuckle boxing. I was a great boxer. I always won.
I guess I would be disturbed by the roughness of it all. But Zach did use the ring to teach those young men how to box. He taught them the value of decency and fair play and how to avoid unnecessary fights and stay out of trouble.
And Emma did her fair share in the community as well. She was involved at the Methodist, and she was involved in community circles at the Methodist Church. And we would always open up our homes to people who needed a place to stay. See, La Crosse didn't exactly have established black codes by law, but people of color knew where they weren't welcome, at the restaurants and the boarding houses. So the Moss and Son and the Shivers families, we will always open up our homes to apprentices and travelers.
Zach made a good living in his shop, and because of that, we were able to share with our community.
Well, that was easy to do when you offered them a free newspaper and a breakfast every morning.
You made up for it with profits and tips. Zach, you know you only charge 5 cents for a haircut?
Does that mean I must charge you the same 20 cents I charge everyone else in this room?
We made a good living here in La Crosse. We had 3 children. Sadly, only 2 of them lived to be adults, June and Zach Orvis.
Yes, we did have a good life. It wasn't smooth sailing, but we did all right. Thankfully, we lived to be relatively old.
Good afternoon,
Oh,
my constituents.
thank you. Good afternoon.
How are you all today? Excellent. I am George Edwin Taylor. Was I born son of a free person or of a slave? Actually, it didn't matter. You see, I was an orphan by the time I was 5 years old. Since my mother was a free person, the law said I was free. My father, however, was a slave. And in February 1859, Arkansas said all free people of color had to leave the state. I was only 2 years old then. What I learned at a young age is that the death rate in this country is very high for all people of color, as well as for the poor. This was the beginning of what developed my political philosophy. Now, I don't remember much of my life growing up on the streets of Alton, Illinois after my mother died. I do remember, though, that I was a street urchin. I lived for several years in dry goods boxes at the wharf. I rescued myself by hiding on the riverboat Hawkeye State. It traveled up the Mississippi to La Crosse, Wisconsin. There, I met Henry Southall, who was a black riverboat man. Later, I met his wife, Agnes. Now, it was a smart thing for a hungry young child to attach himself to 2 cooks. It's too bad, though, I messed up that relationship by getting in trouble with the law. As a result, I was sent to live with Elizabeth Burt as a foster child. That would have been around 1868. Later in life, when she was having financial troubles, I helped her out. It was the least I could do for her after all she had done for me. But the greatest influence in my life came when I met Nathan Smith. Nathan Smith taught me the meaning of hard work. It was his firm hand and sound thinking that helped me understand the role of citizenship and the importance of an education. Nathan Smith was a farmer and a former slave. He was self-educated and disciplined in his work ethic. Nathan was dedicated to his community. Many men and women of all races sought his advice. I was witness to this man's efforts in our neighborhoods in West Salem and La Crosse. Now, the court sent many young, unruly people to his farm instead of a penitentiary for rehabilitation. I was one of these young men. Senior citizens, abandoned by their families, also found a home with him. we'd all help Nathan and his wife Sarah run their farm in West Salem. Nathan eventually sent 4 young men to college. Again, I was one of these young men. As a black man, I'd like to have been viewed with the greatness of Booker T. Washington, Frederick Douglass, W.E.B. Du Bois. These men could have been the ones to run for president opposite Teddy Roosevelt in 1904. These men. Instead, it was me. All I can say is, if you were in a room full of people wanting their civil and political rights, how do you start? How do you look into the eyes of the people in that room and say, it is not your time in this generation to receive equal rights under the law? How did I view the people in this imaginary room? They were all workers, and workers needed to have equal representation in the legislature. They should not be hindered by special interests and the money they use to buy politicians. If the workers were to have equal representation, education, civil, and political rights, the workers would move the country in the right direction. This was a populist view. However, it was no longer acceptable in America. It was more palatable coming from a black man running for president in 1904 as a member of the National Negro Liberty Party. I eventually moved to Florida. In 1910, I was employed by Tampa's Daily Promoter. I was also one of the editors of the Daily Times Union, the Black Star edition of the Florida Times Union. I was one of the most influential black Democrats in the United States. I even marched in President Woodrow Wilson's inaugural parade in Washington, D.C. I lived the rest of my life in Jacksonville until I passed away in December 1925. I'd like to think I led a very active life and that I made a difference. Even though my run for president was unsuccessful, I still shed light on the many issues in the black community that needed to be addressed. You have our gratitude for taking this opportunity to share with us the memories of our time here in La Crosse. We hope that as you learn more about African Americans and the impact we have had in this community, that you will be inspired by us. Thank you. Have a nice day.